Hey all, it's Professor Marinos, and today we're going to begin our unit on ion exchange and adsorption. So in the last unit we considered weathering, that is the dissolution of solid phases into aqueous solution. And in this unit we're just going to simply consider the reverse process. What happens when solutes that are in an aqueous solution become attached to mineral phases and are removed from solution. So let's just jump into that. For this module's learning objectives, first, I want you to be able to describe the primary categories of reactions that occur between solutes and solid phases. And secondly, describe the properties of soils that drive ion exchange. And for the specific video, by the end of this video, you should be able to describe two ways in which interactions between solutes and solid surfaces have impacts on human health and well-being. And secondly, describe the difference between diffuse electrostatic interactions, outer sphere complexation, and inner sphere complexation reactions, and describe why some of these reactions are more permanent than others. So let's just get into it. So let's begin this exploration by just considering our farmer's field right here. This field is probably going to have a lot of fertilizer applied to it so that crops can grow well. Plants need nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, a lot of different nutrients to grow. And so farmers will just put salts on their fields, inorganic fertilizers, in order to increase the fertility of their fields. This might include things like ammonium nitrate. This contains two forms of nitrogen, a cationic and an anionic form of nitrogen, so this is a very potent nitrogen fertilizer. Maybe they'll put on calcium superphosphate, CaH2PO4, to mostly provide phosphorus fertilization, but also, calcium isn't negligible either, so this provides both calcium and phosphorus to plants. Or something like potassium sulfate. Potassium sulfate contributes the major nutrient potassium, in addition to contributing sulfate. Sulfate normally is in abundance in soil, so it's not something that plants really need to have fertilized normally. But this salt dissolves to form both potassium ions and sulfate ions in solution. And so farmers will just dump huge quantities of these things on their fields. And say that you have a drainage ditch running through your field, just like right here. You'd expect that the chemistry of that drainage ditch might reflect somewhat the chemistry of the fertilizer you put on it, especially if you're applying these fertilizers in vast excess of plant needs, such as farmers like to do so that they grow best. But if you go and take a water sample from this little drainage ditch right here, the results might surprise you. You might take a sample and you would find out that there's, very little ammonium coming out, vanishingly little phosphate in solution, and also just a tiny bit of calcium. But you might find out that in contrast, you have huge amounts of sulfate coming out and you have huge amounts of nitrate coming out of your stream. So why, even though all these things were applied in very, very large quantities, why do you only see sulfate and nitrate coming out in abundance, and these other elements, or these other ions, you see in vastly smaller quantities than the amounts that were applied? Well, the answer to this question is that soils aren't just inert media that water just can run through and transport solutes through. Soils are very reactive with solutes that are in solution. And the fluxes of these elements into the stream is greatly controlled by the interaction between the solid phases in the soils and the solutes in solution. So just to summarize this, retention of solutes in soils, aquifers, and sediments is strongly controlled by the interaction, that is the adsorption and desorption of solids or solutes to solid phases. So let's just picture a clay mineral right here. This little hexagonal clay mineral I've outlined here. Let's begin to understand what these mechanisms are. Well, phosphorus, if you put phosphorus into a soil, that might form a very tight bond with the edge of this clay mineral, such that it is very, very hard to separate this phosphorus from the clay. And so essentially, unless this clay moves, this phosphorus is going to stay in place. Other elements like or other ions that we discussed in the previous slide, such as ammonium and potassium, these ions bear positive charges, potassium 1+, ammonium 1+, and clay surfaces have negative charges on them. And so these opposites attract, you might have these positively charged ions being attracted to the negative clay surfaces, but not all that well. Like this attraction is far less strong than this bond up here. And so you might have some of these just kind of float off into the stream, whereas others are retained. Finally, things like sulfate and nitrate in the stream don't have any electrostatic attraction to this clay particle. In fact, they're repelled from this clay particle because like charges repel each other. And they don't have too strong of a mechanism to bind themselves to this clay particle. And so as a result, what you see is that things like nitrate and sulfate actually do just pass through the soil quite readily and are readily exported into streams. So that's a bit of a cartoon example of how adsorption to solid phases, such as this clay particle, can control the fluxes of nutrients into receiving water bodies and into groundwater. We'll get a bit more into these mechanisms in a sec. I just want to run through a few more examples with you. Another great example of sorption is the sorption of trichloroethylene, which is over here, trichloroethylene, which was a solvent that was used for many years in things like dry cleaning. This actually is a bottle used for anesthesia. They used to give this to people as an anesthetic during surgery. We've since found out that it has very, very bad health consequences for you, so we no longer do that. But this is a major contaminant in a lot of groundwater. Like unscrupulous dry cleaning places would dump a bunch of this stuff out in the back and let it evaporate, not realizing that someone's going into the soil. And so this is an organic chemical, trichloroethylene, a chlorinated organic chemical. And people are always looking for ways to remediate the removal of trichloroethylene from water because, like I said, it is a persistent threat to human health. And lots of times the form that this takes is adding some sort of adsorbent, such as this biochar right here, that can absorb trichloroethylene. The trichloroethylene bonds to the surface of it, and this results in the effective sequestration of the trichloroethylene such that you can line a pit with this stuff or make a perimeter around your toxic plume that was introduced into the water. And you can effectively provide barriers for that plume to stop the further migration of trichloroethylene into your groundwater. So this is another great example of how adsorptive processes can retard the movement of solutes or even effectively remove them permanently. And this is the exact same idea as if you eat some toxins or something and you have to go to the hospital and you get activated charcoal pumped in your stomach. This sort of carbon is a highly reactive surface, just like activated charcoal, with a very, very large surface area. And what that does is it provides a lot of reactive surface for any toxins to adsorb to. And so that's a mechanism both of TCE removal and of, I don't know, if you eat too much aspirin or something, the aspirin would sorb to this in your stomach if you were given activated charcoal. So let's just go through a little bit of terminology related to sorption. The thing that something is absorbing to, the solid phase is called the sorbent. And the sorbent interacts with the ions in solution via surface functional groups. So we talked a little bit about surface functional groups in the context of dissolved organic matter, but solid phases also have surface functional groups that are going to interact with ions in solution. And something that is being adsorbed to a sorbent is called a sorbate. And again, this connection is performed via this surface functional group. And an ion that's just floating around in solution that could potentially be sorbed is called a sorptive. Here we have a copper 2+ ion floating around in solution with a shell of waters surrounding it. So just bear these terms in mind as we move through this. We're going to make frequent reference to these terms. Sorbent, solid phase; sorbate, something that is sorbed to a solid phase; and a sorptive is something that could potentially be sorbed to a solid phase. Sorb, 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 sorb. Okay, so let's now consider some actual mechanisms of how this happens. So first I want you to consider these ions that are just floating around in solution over here. And you'll recall from our first lecture that even though we write out ions as just being Cu2+ or whatever in solution, or this is a chloride, and this is a calcium actually. Actually what you have surrounding each ion is a bunch of electrostatically bonded waters. So again, this is a positive ion, and so these oxygens, which are the dark blue here, these bear a negative charge, so that we have a kind of a surrounding shell of water surrounding this ion with all the oxygens facing inward, because the opposite charges, the negative oxygen and the positive calcium, attract each other. And what this is called a hydration shell. It's just a bunch of waters that surround an ion in solution due to electrostatic attraction. The opposite thing happens in chloride. You have all the hydrogens pointing towards the negatively charged chloride ion, because these hydrogens are the positive end of the dipole moment of water. Okay, so this is what's happening in solution. What happens when you introduce a solid into this equation? Well, let's look at this diagram here. Here we have a solid all the way over here. This is a solid that bears a negatively charged surface. And why it bears a negatively charged surface is something we're going to get to in a second. But there are a few different kinds of reactions that you can consider occurring here. The first that we should consider is this diffuse ion swarm. The diffuse ion swarm is simply a lot of positively charged ions that are electrostatically attracted to the negatively charged surface, but aren't in direct contact with that surface. So these are kind of just like jostling for position. They're electrostatically attracted to the surface, but other waters and other ions that are closer to the surface are intervening with them, actually directly bonding and attaching to the surface. So at any given time around a negatively charged particle, such as this iron oxyhydroxide that we have over here, or any sort of metal oxyhydroxide, you have this diffuse ion swarm of all these ions kind of just, bumping up against each other, trying to get towards this negatively charged surface over here. Secondly, you might have something that forms an outer sphere complex. So you'll note again that there's this hydration shell here. And an outer sphere complex is simply an ion that has butted up against the solid surface here, but it still has its intervening hydration shell here. And so the water molecule here is actually, with these hydrogens poking out, is actually what is interacting with this negatively charged surface. And so you have a weak electrostatic bond between these two, these hydrogens on this water and this solid surface. And then this in turn mediates this bond between the water and the ion of interest. So you kind of have the water performing a bridge function between the solid surface and the ion that you're interested in. So this is called an outer sphere complex, when you still have your hydration shell surrounding an ion as it comes in contact with a solid surface. Finally, you have what's called an inner sphere complex, and this is when the molecule has lost its, or the atom ion, one of those, has lost its hydration shell, and is in turn, the ion is directly interacting with the surface of the mineral. And this tends to be the strongest kind of bond, because you don't have this intervening water and you don't have all these intervening molecules right here. You just have the ion directly touching the solid surface, or directly bonding with the solid surface. So these complexation reactions happen in what's called the stern layer, which is shown here, which is the layer immediately surrounding the solid surface. And this happens out in the outer diffuse layer, all this ion swarming around the solid particle. So 3 bond types that you should become familiar with. We're going to consider each in turn. And 2 of these definitely involve electrostatic attraction. This one is, this diffuse swarm is strictly driven by electrostatic attraction. And this outer sphere complex is also driven by electrostatic attraction. These inner sphere complexes don't necessarily need to be electrostatically driven, though. You can actually have not just attraction of ions via electrostatic forces, but you can actually have covalent bonding between a sorbent and the sorbate. So keep that in mind. These can be either covalent or just electrostatic, whereas these 2 types, outer sphere complex and diffuse swarm, are just driven by electrostatic attraction. Just to summarize, the diffuse ion swarm consists of ions electrostatically attracted to a solid surface, but not in direct contact. An outer sphere complex is a bond between a solid and an ion that is mediated by water between them. So water is relaying the attractive forces between that ion and the solid surface. And finally, an inner sphere complex is a bond directly between a solid and an ion with no intervening water in a hydration shell. And this spans a gradient of weak bonds up at the top. Diffuse ion swarming is the weakest form of bonding to a surface. Two very strong interactions at the bottom. Inner sphere complexes can effectively sequester elements for a very long time and very strongly. So that's all I have for you. In this next unit, we're going to launch into why surfaces have negative charges, which is a big open question for you, I'm sure, and what this means for which ions can sorb to that surface via electrostatic attraction. So I'll see you then.